All right, well, welcome everyone. We'll kick this off. This is the awesome iOS developers group. We see a lot of new faces, so that's good. A lot of returning faces as well. For anybody that is new, welcome. We're here on the first Tuesday of every month, 7 to 9 p.m. up here in the classroom. As you were asking, we do have a very wide range of members that come out. People that might be thinking about iOS, people just getting started, people that work at it every day. I think the most powerful part, most valuable part of our group is the local network. So I do encourage everybody to mingle and meet other people in the group. I always say it's nice to have somebody to talk to and come to the pot. So tonight we have an awesome presentation lined up, which I'll introduce in a second. And then afterwards we'll have more time for the networking and hanging out. And then time for any announcements of anything going on locally that anybody wants to share. So the presentation tonight is from Conrad Stoll at Mutual Mobile. It's going to be on wish list for WatchKit. For anybody that doesn't know, Mutual Mobile is a giant firm here in town. They've done projects with Google, Xerox, Audi, and many more. They describe themselves as an emerging tech agency that builds breakthrough products for a more connected world. So I'm sure, no matter where you are on that spectrum, everyone will learn some things tonight from Conrad's presentation. I will turn it over to Conrad.
Sweet. Hey, good to see all you and to know you guys. I don't recognize very many people, so it's fun to be here for the first time. Like you said, my name is Conrad Stoll. I work at Mutual Mobile. I'm an architect there, specializing mostly in iOS development. I've been full-time in the iOS industry for a little over 4 years now, and really just loving every minute of it. And kind of what's exciting about iOS is, we're not just iOS developers, we're also Mac and now Apple Watch and car developers and hopefully soon Apple TV developers. So, it's kind of a fun, and iPad for that matter. So it's, there's no end of kind of fun devices and cool tools that we have at our disposal. And I think we're all pretty excited about the Apple Watch launch and just to be able to build new things with WatchKit. I know we are at Mutual Mobile. We've been working pretty hard on Apple Watch development since the SDK came out. We had a group of developers who were doing daily lunch sessions talking about the SDK and what we could build with it. And we ended up actually building a lot of prototypes that we shared with some of our clients back in December. So we've actually had about 4 or 5 Apple Watch apps that have been in progress as real projects for several months now, and most of those are ready to ship already. And so we've got a lot of experience with developing for the watch. So I thought I'd just kind of give you guys an overview of what it's like, and then kind of just start to share some thoughts on what could be next, like what would we like to do with this in the future. Before we get started, I think it's important to remind us that we're all new. Like, even if we've been doing Apple Watch development for 3 months, it's still only 3 months. We've had the iOS SDK for 8 years now. So please ask questions. Feel free to stop me at any point. I think we'll have a pretty healthy amount of time at the end for Q&A. So ask me questions, ask questions on the developer forums on Twitter, ask yourselves questions. So, we're all kind of in this together. It's something that we're all going to be learning at the same time. Kind of the agenda, going to do a quick overview of just what WatchKit is, like what you can do with it, go through the wish list, and then some Q&A at the end. I thought just as a way to get started, the presentation is not about any specific app. It's really about the process of developing for the watch. But this is at least a project that I can talk openly about. It's a fitness app that I built on the side called Runtime. I really like to run, and so I built an app on the phone, more as just kind of a playground for myself to play with new things as a developer. And so the first thing that I did was I built a running app for the watch, which is basically an extension of Runtime, which is a iPhone run tracking app. And so if you can see the screenshots, I know they're a little bit small. The watch is kind of a little tiny device. The app basically has 4 screens. And so the first one is the stopwatch, where you can pause and control the run. You can start a new run or reset it. And it also shows you stats about your run, like your distance, your pace, your step count. And those are all stats that if you opened the iPhone app while it was running, you would see the same information. And so it's more or less a remote control for the running app on your phone. On the second page, you can see a map, which is just showing you the location of where you are currently. On runtime, on the phone, it actually shows you your entire route as you've been running, but there's not really a capability to do that yet on the watch. The third screen is a split time, so showing you your mile time for each mile that you've run, or kilometer if you're in metric. And then the last screen is an elevation plot. And I'll talk a little bit more about how all of these work in detail later, but just to give you an idea, this is kind of what an Apple Watch app might look like. Watch apps can also have a glance, which is something that when you're visiting the watch face, you can swipe up from the bottom, and that reveals the list of glances that are in a page interface, so you can swipe between them. And there's a lot of system glances, like your next appointment, current weather, stocks. There's a now playing glance to control the iPod and whatever music is currently playing. And so for runtime, the glance is your current step count for the day. And then if you have a run in progress, the time, pace, and distance for that run. And just a quick video of what this looks like in the simulator. It's just kind of swiping between screens. Unfortunately, in the simulator, location simulation doesn't work, which makes testing this really fun for the watch. But you can see that if you do things like pause it on the watch, that pauses the phone. If you pause it on the phone, it pauses it on the watch. So there's a little bit of a challenge we'll talk about later, which is keeping data in sync between the phone and the watch. That's one of the things that's been kind of harder about WatchKit to get right. So, also going to warn you ahead of time, there's not much code in this presentation. I think there's actually zero code in this presentation. And part of the reason for that is building a watch app really doesn't require a lot of code. I mean, for several of the apps that we've built for clients already, we're building these apps with less than like 10 classes of new code that's being written specifically for the watch. So it really is fairly basic to build a new app for the watch. And a lot of that is because you're not building an app from scratch. A WatchKit app is an extension of the app on the phone. So the only thing that you're really adding to it is the interface controllers that represent the screens for the watch. There may be some additional logic or data handling or network requests that you have to do to support that, but that's, in our experience at least, usually fairly minimal. And so a lot of the code is fairly self-explanatory to build the UI for the watch. So I've kind of elected not to go into that in too much detail. There's plenty of resources and tutorials for doing that. And I've chosen to talk more about kind of what the capabilities are and what you might choose to do with the tools that Apple's provided. So as I said, a WatchKit app is basically just another type of extension to an iPhone app. Just like real quick, how many people have done anything with WatchKit at all so far? Anything at all? Probably just a few people. Has anyone done anything with Today extensions, sharing extensions, any of the other kind of iOS 8 extensions? If you're familiar with at least the concepts of building a Today extension, then building a watch app will seem very familiar to you. There are certain limitations because an extension is running in a separate process. So that's something that you do have to consider when you're building both a regular iOS 8 extension as well as a WatchKit app, since it's basically the same thing. But like I said, you can sort of use that to your advantage since you do have full access to the iPhone app running in a separate process and the entire code base that represents that iPhone application. So there's a lot you can leverage there to make your life a little bit easier as a developer. One of the core things to understand about extensions, and specifically WatchKit extensions, is they're pretty reliant on this concept called app groups. And what an app group is, it's an entitlement between your app ID and a provisioning profile. And so the app group is a way to create a shared directory that both your iPhone app and your watch app can write to and read to. So if you have to pass information from your phone app, like a list of contacts or some kind of configuration data or images that may come back from a network request or the response from a network request, or you can even share like your core data model if you want to. All that has to actually be placed into the shared app group, which is this directory, this magic directory that both apps can write to. If you try to just write or read to the regular documents directory, you'll have a different one for your phone app and your watch app. So using the shared app group or the shared NS user defaults is the only way you have to share information between the two apps. You're required to have your phone present for the WatchKit app to run. If your phone isn't present, the app won't launch at all. So, and if it is launched, it'll close. So you have to have your phone with you. Your watch has to be able to detect that phone somehow. And that's partly for the data connection to the internet. So if you're trying to make network requests or send posts or use the background URL session APIs that we got, I think a year or two ago, you have to have the phone present to do all that work for you. And also to access a lot of the sensors on the phone. So things like GPS that don't exist on the watch. If you need that information, like I do for my running app, that requires a connection to the phone to get all that information. The other thing that some people don't quite understand about developing for the Apple Watch is you're not actually building an app that runs on the watch. Your app is an extension, and so all of this CPU activity is happening on the phone itself, and that's pushing UI updates over Bluetooth to the watch. So if you think about like having an IV outlet to a UI label, and you set like the text on that label, on the phone, that's going out to a view, which is going to a layer to make an update that is sent to the render server and updates the screen. On the watch, that's sent to a queue on the phone, which sends those commands over time via Bluetooth to the watch to trigger the remote UI update on the watch itself. So there is a slight delay between setting the value of a label in your extension, which is doing all the computation to figure out what that label should say, and that actually getting to the watch and being presented as hello world or whatever it is that you've chosen to display on that label. And the same is true for images. So if you're trying to show an image in an image view, it has to actually package that image up, send it over Bluetooth to the watch, and then display it in an image view. So that's something that's kind of important to remember is you want to be very careful about how you structure your UI updates. You want them to be minimal, to be fast, and to not update them too many times, otherwise your performance will really be impacted. The other thing is storyboards. So if you were avoiding using storyboards, well, you're gonna have to get used to them because there's no other way to build your UI on Apple Watch than to use the storyboard. All of the controls that we have that I'm gonna go through in the next slides are all brand new to WatchKit. There is no UI label on WatchKit. You can't, if you try to call UI label alloc init with frame and add it to a subview, there's no view to add it to. There's no way to programmatically create user interface elements on the watch. Everything has to be configured and set up and installed in the storyboard in order for it to appear on the watch. So you have to kind of get really comfortable with storyboards. There's also a very new form of layout with the Apple Watch. There is no auto layout, there is no coordinate system. So it's all very different. It's much simpler, I think, but it is different from what we're used to as iOS or Mac developers. We're all very used to view controllers on iOS, and we should feel very at home with interface controllers on Apple Watch. An interface controller basically represents a screen. So if you have a screen in a paginated interface, or if you have a drill-down navigation hierarchy, each of those screens is represented as an interface controller. You can also present interface controllers modally. If you get a notification, and it's a dynamic notification that has a very rich layout, that's actually a subclass of interface controller, which is some sort of WK dynamic long look something interface controller. And glances are also interface controllers. So pretty much everything is an interface controller. They're very, very lightweight, especially compared to view controllers. Really, they're just there to kind of manage the state of that screen. They don't have a view or anything that you can add data to. It's just a place where you can associate your IV outlets from the storyboard and get a couple of kind of life cycle callbacks when the interface controller becomes active or deactivates or is initialized and all that kind of stuff. So the first type of little control that we have is a label. I'm sure we're all very familiar with labels. They work pretty much exactly as you would expect on the watch. The system font on the Apple Watch is San Francisco. And so that's the default that you get both in a storyboard. And if you call system font with size on the extension and set that on the watch, that will also default to San Francisco. You can use custom fonts. So there are a couple of other fonts that are installed by default on the watch, like Helvetica is available. And you can also bundle your own custom font if you have it. But you kind of want to think twice about doing that because Apple built San Francisco to be the most readable font on the watch. And I would say that they probably got that right. So I think you can use a custom font if you want to, but you kind of want to think twice about whether or not you should use one. You also have attributed text. So you have pretty rich support to do things like change kerning, change the baseline, like the line width between lines on the watch. You can change color. You have access to do things like underline and strike through. So it is a pretty rich type of text layout system. It's not quite as rich as something like TextKit or Core Text, but for being a first version software on the watch, it's actually pretty solid. The one thing that you can't do, which is kind of a bummer, is you can't add images in line to a label. So if you're familiar with TextKit, there's a way to add a text attachment, which can be an image that will show up and be like laid out and rendered in line in that label. There's no way to do that on the watch. It just ignores it if you try to add that there. So that's a little bit of a bummer, but overall, the label functionality is pretty solid. If you want to limit something to just a few lines, it'll tail truncate the end. It'll also support automatic scaling of the font size. So if you want to kind of make it, shrink down a few percentage points to like from size 12 to size 8 or something like that, there's support for that built in. It also supports dynamic type out of the box. So in iOS 7, Apple introduced the kind of like set your system font size to some smaller value or some larger value. And if you build in support to that in your iOS app, then you get font scaling across your entire application. That's all built in for free with Apple Watch. So you can set type styles like body or caption 1 or caption 2 or footnote. And if you change the font setting on the watch, then that will all update all of your labels automatically to be larger or smaller. And you get that for free without having to do anything if you have to use the built-in label functionality. The other thing that's interesting here is relative layout. So when you have like a label on something like an iPhone, you're either setting some constraints to make it like the full size, like the full width of the view, or maybe you're giving it like a concrete frame that's a specific size. You can still have something that's a concrete frame on Apple Watch, but there's also this notion of a relative layout. So you can say like very easily, like put a label here and put a label next to it in the same group and say, this label takes up 60% of the frame and this one takes up 40%. And those are just two little values that you might change in the storyboard. And you get really cool like text wrapping behavior and stuff like that for free by doing that. So all of this, like in terms of layout, is really kind of like playing with Legos, where the central structure of a screen is a group. And a group is basically like your building block. So if you imagine like playing with Legos, then you're kind of just stacking these things on top of each other, and you can change the behavior to kind of build whatever structure you want, more or less. So if you want to have like 3 labels stacked on top of each other, then that's a single group which has a vertical layout orientation, and you add 3 labels to it, and those labels will just be laid out 1, 2, 3, and they'll automatically size to fit their content. So if the first one's really short, the second one's medium, and the third one is like 4 lines long, it will just size each one appropriately and size the screen so that you can scroll down to view all of the content. And that's all given to you for free. If you want to do something a little bit more complicated, like you want to have the 3 labels, but at the top, you want to have like a little image off on the right. You might do that with a single group, a group at the top, which has a horizontal orientation, a label that's left aligned, an image that's right aligned, and then a label below it. And so you can mix and match groups to create lots of really interesting types of layouts. Groups are the only thing that you can nest on top of each other. So you can't put like an image on top of, or a label on top of a label, or a label on top of a button, or anything like that. But you can have a group that has another group that has another group that has another group, and you can do some really interesting things there. Groups are also super powerful because they can have background colors and background images. So one of the cool tricks that we came up with was you have a image that you create in Photoshop that just has like a black mask and then a little patch of alpha in the center that represents some icon. You can put that on top of a group and then change the group's background color to dynamically change the color of an icon without having to bundle 20 assets into your watch app. So there's really cool little things like that that you can do with groups that maybe, I mean, you could do it on iOS by just like setting the same thing as an image and then changing the background color of the subview, but you don't really expect to see that kind of behavior on the watch, and there's some cool optimizations you can do there to create some really interesting behavior. And groups have the same sort of proportional layout structure as all the rest of the views do. So if you want to set a group that's like 30% of the width or 100% or that goes vertically and it only takes up like a certain amount of space, you can also anchor them at like the top or the bottom or the center, left or right or center. So there's really a lot of flexibility there. I kind of encourage you to just play around with it a little bit. And if you want to come up with something really creative, there's probably a way to do it. Images are really neat on the watch. Certainly, you know, like if we're just like creating kind of a interesting layout and we want to use some decoration or maybe set the image for a button or an icon, that's all obviously supported. Apple Watch uses the asset catalog, just like we expect on iOS and the Mac now. You can also include images in bundles. This is something you would do if you're doing image sequences, like we'll talk about in a second. And you can also dynamically cache images on the watch. So if you have things like user avatars, you can store those in a cache that's actually on the physical watch, and then you can access those at runtime so that you get a little bit faster performance that way. Image sequences are kind of it's kind of like the one sweet solution from original iPhone development, if people are familiar with that. And Steve Jobs was like, and for iOS development, we have this sweet solution. We call it web apps. That's kind of like what this is for animation on the watch. It's like, and you can do animations on the watch, and they're called image sequences. So it's basically an animated GIF, is more or less what it is, that you can control the frame rate. And so you do that by going into Photoshop or After Effects or whatever your tool of choice is, and creating a sequence of images that are just pieced out from an animation at a specific frame rate. Then you can bundle all those images that are numbered, starting with 0 to however many frames you have. You bundle that all on the watch, and then you say animate from frame 0 to frame whatever over this amount of time, and that's an animation. So this works really well for things like loading indicators, like if you want to create a little spinner or maybe something a little more custom. That's very easy to do. It actually works really well. What it doesn't work so well for is dynamically animating the actual user interface. I'll talk about that more and kind of what I wish was better about WatchKit, but that's something that this isn't really made for. It's more made for things like loading indicators and simple little animations. Buttons are pretty much exactly what you'd expect. Don't really know what else to say about buttons. One of the limitations that they have is they don't have tap states. So if you're used to having like a tap down, it shows like a different graphic or something like that. That doesn't exist. There is a default like tap state on the watch, but you have no way to customize that behavior. You can set titles or images as buttons. So one of the things that a friend of mine and I did that I thought was pretty clever is if I go back to runtime, the little pause button over on the side there, that's actually a button with a background image that says pause at the bottom, and then the title of the button is the elapsed time. So that's kind of a fun way to combine both a button and what would have been a label to save a little bit of space on the watch. Maps are also on the watch. You saw one in runtime. There are a lot of limitations there. So there's no interactivity. So if you tap on the map at all, it'll launch the Maps app on the watch. There's also no support for things like overlays. So if you're used to building like a complex weather app or something to overlay a route, like a navigation app or a run tracking app, there's not really a way to do that. You can change the style of a pin. So if you want to have like custom artwork that represents the user's location or whatever location you've specified, you can set that, which works well. And you also have control over like the region it's visible. So if you want it to be more zoomed in or zoomed out, it's the same MapKit programming interface for setting like that zoom level in that region that's visible. Switches, sliders, spacers, I mean, they're fairly niche kind of controls. They're probably not going to be super common in your app, but they are available if you need them. So if you have like some basic settings, I would personally kind of advise against having a lot of settings in a watch app. Like that feels like something that's kind of more suited for being on the phone itself. But if you have some things you need to control there, then these controls are available to you.
Can you set the watch settings from the phone?
Sure. It depends on how you want to do that. Like if you are trying to build it in a way that supports like the actual settings app settings, that could be a little bit hairy. But if you just have like some settings that you maintain yourself in your app in a plist or something, then absolutely you could change those on the watch and it would update on the phone. You'd have to make sure that the updates.
I mean, the other way around. Can your settings all be on the phone and they affect, for example, things like background on the watch?
Yeah, so that would be, or another good example would be like, if anyone's seen the guided tour video for Apple Watch for the Messages app that they put out, there's a way that on the phone for the Apple Watch app, you can set a list of quick replies that will be like the default set when you launch Messages on the phone. You do the same type of thing, like if you were building a messaging app on the Apple Watch on your own, you have that list that you define in the phone app. The trick would be transferring it to the app group, which is the shared data container that both apps can write to, and then the watch could read that. So anytime you update it on the phone, your watch would activate and just read that list, or what plist or whatever it is, to get its settings from there.
So the images animation, like when we see just a regular watch face with the second hand going one image per.
Well, so all of Apple's apps are native, so they can do that with native rendering if they want to. But you could build the same thing. Like if you were going, we don't have access to build watch faces, obviously, but if you wanted to simulate like a watch face or a timer in your own app, then yes, it would be 360, 120, however many images you want to have, and then you just choose the one based on percentage of which one it should be showing. Speaking of time, so two new controls actually that don't exist on iOS, but honestly probably should, are the date and timer controls on WatchKit. The WK interface date is a really interesting control that you basically just give it a date object, or I think you can also give it a calendar object, and it just shows you the current time. And you set like a style on it of, do you want it to be like numerical time, like 3:12:22: or space AM PM, or do you want it to be like 3H 4M 22S? You can set a bunch of different styles on it that is also pretty cool. It's not quite as flexible as you might like it to be, but it's pretty cool. And I mean, for the amount of times that people have gotten dates and times wrong in the history of iOS, it seems pretty logical that they would try to get that right on the watch. So if you are building an app that actually needs to show current time, that's definitely the way to do it. The current time is visible in the title bar of your app. The only time it's not is if you present a modal interface controller, then that only shows the cancel button in the top left. It does not show the current time in the top right. I think glances also do not show the current time. So when the user swipes up to reveal your glance, the time is hidden. It's because you're going from the watch face. The other one that's there is the timer, WK interface timer. And so that's one where you can create either a countdown timer or a stopwatch. So if you envision something like counting up 1 second or every minute or whatever, That is doable using the WK interface timer. And the same thing with like an alarm or something like that. Like if you're trying to tell the user like you have an hour before like your, I don't know, your meter for your car expires or before your laundry is done or whatever, then you could use the WK interface timer to do that. Tables. So tables are more or less the heart and soul of really most any app. I mean, and certainly in iOS, I'm sure it's one of the most well-used controls. And certainly on the original iPhone, it was really the heart and soul of any app. And I think it's going to be the same on a lot of watch apps, that people are going to want to have like a list of content that they want to show. And so, tables are actually pretty good on the watch. They're the only place on the watch that you can dynamically add content to your screen, since you can specify the number of rows you want to have for your table, and you can change the content. You can have multiple row types. They're actually probably the most flexible part of the interface on the watch. So in a lot of cases, you might want to think of, can I build this with a table? And if the answer is yes, you may want to just go for it. Tables are composed of row controllers. So a row controller is more or less synonymous with a UI table view cell. So if you have like a table that has different types of content in it, each of those cells will have a different row controller. And the row controller is how you actually set content on the watch. So when you're reloading your table, you tell the table how many cells you have and what type each of the cells is, like what type of row controller it's going to be. And so the table, when you do that, will go off and create rows for all of those cells. And I'm sure some of you just thought, wait a second, it's going to go and create rows for all of those cells? It is. There's no notion of dequeuing table view cells on the watch. So if you have a table with 100 table view cells, you will have a table with 100 table view cells. There's no notion of having 4 or 5 and dequeuing those. And part of the reason is this remote UI update, that if it was having to ask your app, having to ask your extension, like every time a new row appeared, what the contents of that row were, that just wouldn't work, because it'd have to make 2 trips over Bluetooth to populate that UI. So for better or for worse, it's actually faster for it to go and create 100 table view cells than it is to have the dequeuing system we have on iOS. The next question, though, is do you really need to have 100 table view cells on the watch? The answer is hopefully no, but you can if you need to. So there's all sorts of things you can do to optimize that if that ends up being a requirement for you. One of the things is to load cells in batches. So like tell the table, load the first 5, just make that visible now, and then kind of batch insertions at the bottom. Say like load 5 more, maybe do that like once a second or so, and that'll improve the loading performance a little bit. But that should probably be kind of an edge case, at least for most of the stuff we've been doing. We've been seeing anywhere from like 10 to 20 rows as being kind of about what we're looking for a lot of the use cases we're developing for. The other thing on WatchKit is menus. So I'm sure you guys have heard of the new Force Touch gesture that I guess just made its way to the new trackpad as well. That's certainly a big part of developing for the watch. Apple's doing a lot of interesting things with it, and I think so are we. There's a lot of kind of configuration options and controls that make sense, like contextually in the Force Touch menu. It's important to think of context with the Force Touch menu, that it is something that's more or less based on the current screen that you're on. So if you imagine like, it's like on runtime, for example, that the first screen is the stopwatch. Force Touch on that, your options are cancel, save, and reset. Because for a run for something that's on a stopwatch, you might imagine those being controls that you would want to have access to. If you were building like say a music player app, a good Force Touch option might be changing the volume or changing the playback rate, something that is kind of contextually related to the screen that you're force pressing on. What you don't want to have happen, I think it was Rene Ritchie that coined this term, is you don't want to have Force Touch hamburger menus where it just kind of becomes like the desk drawer that you just shove everything into that you can't find a home for it. You do kind of want to think about what are the options that you really want to provide in that Force Touch menu that makes sense based on what the user is doing. So what can you build with all this? Well, you can pretty much build anything you can build with Legos. So you could build a helicarrier. You may not want to build a helicarrier. You may want to build something a little bit simpler than a helicarrier. But there is a lot of, I think, really cool stuff that you can do with WatchKit as it is today. You can build glances. So, I mean, I think glances are honestly one of the more exciting things on the watch, where it's kind of this true glanceable type of user interface. Like, I just glance at my phone and I have like 15 message notifications from random stuff on my lock screen. That's not really that glanceable. And if I pull down on the notification center and try to look at like a bunch of these giant Today extensions, does anyone actually use Today extensions like at all? No one?
Meetup is awesome, but that's it.
Yeah, I'll get behind you on Peacock, but like I think I've even built like 4 Today extensions and I don't even use those. So it's like it's just not really it hasn't really worked out that well on iOS 8. I don't feel like, but I'm a little more optimistic about glances on the watch because they're going to be so accessible, and by definition they have to be so simple and so straightforward that I think that's going to make them a little bit more interesting. For a glance, I mean, it really is just a blank interface controller. You can pretty much put whatever you want on it. There's no interaction, so like you can't put buttons or anything on it, but it is a really quick way to launch your app. So if the user looks at your glance and they see something that they want to take action on, they can tap it and that opens them straight into your app.
Is that something that you push to the watch, the glance?
It's part of, you mean in terms of how it gets on the watch?
Yeah, like that watch has 50 apps on it. When you glance, how does it know which one you want to look at?
Oh, well, so it by default will just go to the one that you were previously looking at. So like when you open the glances, you might have 10 or 20 or however many glances. And you can choose in the settings, like if you want, say you have 50 apps and they all have glances, but only 20 of those are actually useful or you actually care about, then on the phone, like watch phone app, you can turn off like which ones have a glance and which ones don't. And you can change the order that they
and then
appear
you would just page it.
Right.
Got it, okay.
And
Kind
it's
of
all,
like pulling down from the top of the phone. Right?
Yep.
Got it.
Notifications, I think, are also super exciting. You were talking about that earlier. I think it may be one of the things that's most undersold about WatchKit, that notifications on the watch look so much better than they do on the phone, that on the phone, you're pretty much just limited to a sentence. Like, what can you compose about what just happened to someone in a sentence, like an ESPN score result? But on the watch, you can do so much more with that. You can show images, you can have rich text layout. So instead of just saying like, Eagles quarterback, whoever threw a touchdown pass to this person, score, whatever, you can actually break it down like team, score, like a line about what happened, have like a football logo, or you could have an image that's dynamically generated. It's like the yardage from like where the play started to the end zone. Like there's so much cool stuff that you could do with notifications on the watch that are going to look really great that is just not even possible on iOS. So I think notifications are huge, or going to be huge on the watch. And they also support actions, the same interface or notification actions that are part of iOS 8. So if you already built those into your iOS 8 application, that when you kind of like swipe to the right or swipe to the left from the lock screen or swipe down from anywhere like while you're logged into the phone, those will all show up on the watch as well, and vice versa. If you build it for the watch, you also get access to that on iOS. So that's a really cool way to make those interactions just a little bit more seamless. Like if you've given someone a notification that is really timely and it's going to tap their wrist and they can just look at it, giving them the option to just tap on a button and have that perform some action is going to be a really big deal.
So when they're wearing a watch, I mean, you haven't had a watch, right? You're like in the same boat we have.
Sorry?
You're in the same boat we have.
Yeah.
So I mean, this is a glance, but when they get a notification, they get like a little feely thing on their wrist.
Yeah, so that's like the whole taptic engine that
Yeah.
is giving them like the haptic feedback, that it is supposed to feel like a tap, and then you turn your wrist over and you can see whatever the
And
notification
because
is.
it's a notification, the watch differentiates that from glance.
Well, the glances you have to actually you have to take some action to swipe up to reveal. And there's actually like a really cool walkthrough in the design guidelines for the watch, because the notifications follow a very different pattern from what exists on iOS. So on iOS, you get a notification and it's just there. It's just a notification. On the watch, it's much more of like a kind of a user journey, if you will, that when you first look at it, you see what they call the short look notification, which is a huge version of your app icon and a title at the bottom that you can specify. It's only like 2 words, so it has to be pretty short. But that appears for like half a second to a second. They don't really say exactly, but it's supposed to be short. And then that transitions to what they call the long look notification, which is a smaller version of the app icon, the app title, and then the blank canvas. And that's what you can define in your storyboard as your dynamic notification that can have a rich text layout, images, and other types of content. And then all of the buttons, if you have interface actions or notification actions, show up below that.
About the tactic engine, do you have any control right now over like the mount or
No,
patterns?
there's no programmer API for it.
Okay, but I mean that's got to be there internally right now for like a heartbeat application thing, so that'll probably be opened up at some point.
WWDC.
Yeah.
Knock on wood. So another example of what you can build for it is a remote control. So that's more or less like what the app I showed earlier for runtime. That's basically a remote control type of app that you have some action that your phone app is doing that it would be easier if you didn't have to pull your phone out of your pocket to do it. I think another really cool example of this is something like Uber, like ordering an Uber, just tapping a button to do that. The SPG app, like to unlock your door by tapping a button on your watch. So if you have an app already that has like a very popular action that somebody is like constantly opening your app to perform, if you have any analytics that say like this is the reason that people launch our app, that's probably the best use case you could have for building a watch app, is just making that more convenient for people. So, I mean, certainly actionable tables, if you have something that's like a list of things that you want to do, like maybe, I don't know, saving something for later or archiving an email or whatever, something that's like you tap on a button and it's some dynamic list of those options, that's something that you could build. Anything for content, whether it's like consuming images. Images actually, I think, is a really cool thing that, like the Instagram app, I'm a big fan of that, the designs that they've put out for that app. Maybe if you have short stories, like it's probably, it's TBD, but I think it's unlikely that you're going to want to read like a feature-length article on your wrist. Maybe some people will. I'm sure someone's going to try it, but it doesn't seem like that's that likely. But maybe for short stories, like maybe 200 words or something, just being able to scroll through that with the digital crown, that might be something that is interesting. And you can certainly build that with like dynamically sized labels that could be infinite in length. It's more just a question of, is that the right use case for the watch or is it not? But I think images, especially like in conjunction with a short story, could be very interesting. Anything that's a quick update. So like building something like for like a thermostat app like Nest to show like at a glance what's the current temperature of like your home thermostat or current weather. Anything about notifications like the sports updates, I think are going to be really interesting. I'm kind of looking forward to that from ESPN. So anything that's like really super glanceable, I think it's going to be really, really cool. Some other examples, I think I touched on a couple of these already. Really, really looking forward to be able to order an Uber from my wrist. A camera viewfinder, I think, would be a really killer app. That's actually one of the Apple apps on the watch. I think certainly to be able to control like a DSLR or like a GoPro or something like that from the watch would just be absolutely amazing. You can imagine like going snowboarding or something and you have like actual access to your GoPro camera from your wrist without having to like go fiddle with that or whatever. That would just be absolutely
You can't
incredible.
broadcast live video in the watch
Well, no, not really. It'd have to be, yeah, so what they showed in the keynote was a security camera, like a garage door camera, that was doing like 1 frame every 5 seconds or so. That's probably about the best you could do. So no, but there's no like native video player or anything like that.
That would be cool.
That would be super cool.
Are there any sensors on it at all?
It has an accelerometer, but I think that's pretty much it. And there's no, well, and I guess the heart rate sensor. That's all I can think of.
So it has an accelerometer?
That's how it knows like when you like lower your wrist and all that kind of stuff.
But all the stuff like for your app, it's all on the phone.
That's all on my phone, yeah, because we don't have access to their accelerometer on the watch.
And when you're running the app on the phone, the app on your watch, the app on the phone doesn't come up, it's still in the background.
It's still in the background. That's something that, for those of you that don't know, one of the advantages that WatchKit extensions have over other extensions is that they can programmatically launch the iPhone app in the background. So if you need to launch the phone app to do something like start location updates in the background or start a background audio session or make a networking request, you can do all of that on the phone app where it's guaranteed to actually finish those things. Whereas the WatchKit extension, as soon as you put your wrist down, it could be killed at any time. So for like networking operations and stuff like that, it's considered a best practice to do all that work on the phone. So what are the problems we have? And I'm sort of conscious of time. I didn't think this would take this long, so I'm kind of going to blow through this a little bit so we can get to Q&A. But if you see anything interesting, feel free to stop me for questions. So sharing data, honestly, the biggest problem we've had so far on the watch really is sharing information. Like you have all this data on your phone and you need to have some way to get it to the watch. And also vice versa, that if you're tapping on things on the watch, like how do you get that back to the phone to keep the UI in sync, like command and control style? So that actually brings me to an open source project that we released recently called Wormhole. And has anyone heard of this? Is anyone using this in their app?
Heard about it.
Heard about it. So if you end up doing any watch development, you definitely are going to want to check this out. It's pretty much become the default way to share information between a WatchKit extension and the iPhone app. It's basically a wrapper around the shared app group containers. So it makes it very easy to pass a message between either side, like from watch to phone or phone to watch. The messages just have to be something that's NS coding compliant. So all that it's doing is taking that message, serializing it to a file, storing the file with a specific identifier in that shared app group. And then on the other side, you can either read that file with that same identifier, or you can also subscribe to be notified whenever that file is changed. So if you imagine something like runtime, where it's updating like your distance and your pace and your elapsed time, those are all updates that are being fired from Wormhole. So anytime the phone is tracking like GPS locations, every time it gets a new location and computes all of those values, it just posts that to the wormhole. And whenever you're looking at the watch app, it updates the UI with the up-to-date information. And same thing the other direction. If you pause the run on your wrist, that sends a message to the wormhole to the phone, and there's a listener on the phone side on that stopwatch UI view controller that when it gets the pause message, it stops all its location updates and all the timers and everything that's going on there. So it works both directions. It's really super seamless. It's using Darwin Notification Center under the hood. If you're super curious and want to go read about that, it's super interesting. But if you're going to be building a watch app that involves sharing information back and forth, this is basically the way to go. It's something that Apple probably should have built a native solution for. So I'm expecting it to be deprecated at some point, or to be Sherlocked at some point by something better from Apple. But at least for now, it solves the problem pretty well. And I should go back and correct one thing. I don't expect it to be deprecated because it relies on Darwin Notification Center, which has been around since iOS original, and the shared app groups, which is a core part of notification or extensions. So it will not be deprecated, that's not really possible, but I'm expecting Apple at some point to release something better. We really wish that we could do more rich, like dynamic animations. If you watch like some of the videos they've put out of the fitness apps on the watch, you can see they're doing things like when you swipe between screens, they'll have like a static component at the top, like we would be accustomed to on iOS. When you swipe to the new screen, they'll have like some content animate up from the bottom. There's not really a way that we can do that right now with WatchKit. And so like actually dynamically animating the user interface would be really nice to do. Same thing goes for things like graphs and charts. So like when I showed the elevation graph from runtime, something that would have been really cool to do would be to dynamically load that as like, progressing from the bottom corner up to the top right or whatever. You can actually try to do that if you want to. You can render a series of frames on the phone and then send those over to the watch to be animated. The problem with that is performance is really shaky. So you're probably looking at several seconds of load time just to be able to show the animation. That's not really realistic. Like nobody wants to wait 5 seconds to see your cool animation. So until we get like true native rendering on a watch, some of that kind of stuff is just really just not going to happen. Same thing kind of there. Wouldn't it be great if we had more access to the digital crown? Like imagine if you're building an audio app and you can use the digital crown as a scrubber to go through like the timeline of a track you're listening to. There's no way to do that right now, but in the long run, that's the kind of thing that we would expect to be able to do. To be able to get like scroll position offset changes, like if you're scrolling through a table, there's no way to be notified if you hit like the bottom of the table to load more content or the top of a table to load more content. There's no events that happen for any of that kind of stuff. The picker view, like this is something you can see in some of the videos where it's like you set the date for a meeting or something like that, or an alarm, something along those lines. There's actually like a scrolling view where you can use the crown to select like a current item or whatever, just like UI picker view in iOS. That's something that's not part of WatchKit. I wish it was. Maybe it will be in the future, because I'm sure we could all think of some cool things to do with that. Access to sensors. There actually is limited access to heart rate data. People just figured this out recently. There's a couple of forum posts about it. There's a lot of great stuff in the developer forums for WatchKit, by the way, and this is one of them. The limitation with heart rate data is that it's sent to HealthKit, and so you can read it from HealthKit, but the limitation is that it's not sent in real time. So if you want to check on like what somebody's heart rate was like an hour or two ago, like when they were running like an hour or two ago, you can get it. But if you want to like show them their current heart rate right now while they're running, this is probably not going to be there. It might be, but it probably won't be. And that's because Apple just doesn't guarantee when they're going to send that information from the heart rate sensor to the phone, since HealthKit is on the phone. So, maybe we'll get better access to that one day. There's no way to detect like wrist detection or gestures. There's no way to do like pinch to zoom or anything, that kind of stuff, or like actual touch point detection. There's none of that kind of stuff. No speaker access, so all the audio, if you want to have an app that plays audio, it has to play it through the phone or through headphones with Bluetooth speakers. No Taptic Engine access. The view lifecycle that we get access to is pretty limited, so we get to see when a screen activates and when it did deactivate. I'd love to at least get like a will deactivate, or maybe a did activate, but certainly pretty limited there in terms of what you can actually do. It's nice that it's simple, but I wish it was just a little bit more that they had there. This one is really tricky. So since you can't like programmatically add things like buttons to an interface, you don't really have a way to do like detailed disclosure things. So if you imagine having like a table view that had 10 cells and you want to be able to detect both a tap on the cell or a tap on like a little info button on the side, there's no way to do that because a button can't have just like an association with a generic IB action.
because the IB action doesn't get a sender object when it's called. So there's no way to know what actually called that IB action. You would have to have like an IB action 1, an IB action 2, an IB action 3, like different methods. So that's pretty messy from like a code reuse standpoint and from just making like a dynamic interface. So there's something a little bit more innovative would be nice to have there. We'd love to get some presentation callbacks. So there's not really any way to know now, like if you dismiss a modal, there's not really a way to know about that, like, or when a modal is presented, when that animation finishes, things like that. When a force touch menu is invoked, there's no way to know that that happened, or when it's closed. So those are all kind of things we'd love to see added at some point. You also have no way to control when your notifications get presented. And there might be a time, like say if you were building like a chat application, that maybe you want to get that first message notification, but that second, third, fourth, fifth, or sixth, maybe you don't want to get all those in a row. There's no like programmatic way to specify like just stop showing me these. I'm not interested in that anymore. Complications. So this to me would be the biggest game changer in a native SDK for the watch. That the complications are the little things around the corners of the watch face, and the ones that Apple has shown us are things like the current weather or stock price or your next meeting. I'm sure there's I think like 10 or 20 of these things that they have built in, but there's no developer API to create your own right now. So if you can imagine like for GoPro, something like a battery indicator or a recording time indicator, or even like a button that sits there on your watch face to like start and stop recording. Those are all things that are possible with like the Apple built-in complications. And I would just love to see support for third-party complications, because I mean, that's like the prime real estate on the wrist is like that, the things around that watch face. So if we could do something with that, I think it'd be just an absolute game changer. Watch faces would be great. I know a lot of designers would love to make some extra cash by building some sweet watch faces, and I hope that that actually happens. I'd probably do something silly like have like a vintage Timex watch face or something like that. I'm sure it'd look terrible, but you know, you've got to think that that's going to happen at some point. That's something that Android Wear can already do. So, you know, here's to hoping that we get watch face access. Glances are a little restrictive. It's not that big of a deal. You have to use San Francisco on glances. You can't use other custom fonts. So that's pretty much it. Honestly, like even with the limitations of what we got with WatchKit, it's still pretty powerful. You can still build, I think, really good applications. Like all the ones that Apple demoed in the keynote and that have come out since then look really solid. I think they look really great. So, I mean, my advice is to go try it out and go use it. I mean, if you have an iPhone app that you're thinking about building a watch app for, I would highly suggest getting started on it, because I think what we have now is already great from a tools perspective, and it's only going to get better. So, cheers. And questions?
I think I already asked them all.
Yeah. Do you know about any, or have you talked to anyone that's used any of the Apple Watches yet?
Nope.
Because I know that like some people have been able to like go to Cupertino and like test their web apps on the watch. But so I'm really interested to see that how Bluetooth, like how fast that Bluetooth is, and like what to expect if it's like half a second or 3 seconds.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, you got to feel like it's at least fast enough. And even if it's not, at least from a developer point of view, we'll kind of all be in the same boat from like a performance impact standpoint.
So if you go on a run or some such, you would still need to have your phone with you.
You would.
Or
Yes.
even for listening to music, that kind of thing. I heard at one point there would be some kind of storage there.
So there is, and I'm kind of guessing a little bit here, there is some like music storage, I think, that you can have like for just the music app, but that won't work for like Spotify or something like that. Couldn't cache music on the watch.
Okay.
There's no headphone port on the watch though, so you'd have to be running with like Bluetooth headphones anyway. And since there's also no GPS on the watch, what Apple's fitness app is doing is just tracking step count. So you have like pedometer distance estimation, but you don't have GPS access.
So like, I play a lot of sports. One of the things I like to do is track, what I'm doing, but I don't carry my phone. Does
So-
the watch have any, how far apart, and does it have any capability at all? Like, can I track my steps without the watch? Like, I put the watch down and I walk with the
Yeah,
phone
it
down,
can,
walk with the
it can
watch.
track your step count, just like like the Fitbit or any of that kind of stuff. But in terms of like how accurate that is or how well that works, don't know.
Any thoughts as to whether they're, everybody thoughts is have an always-on display? I mean, it's kind of, I know for fashion-wise, there's been some debate about, whether having a black square on your wrist at all times is very attractive. But there's nothing been released that would let somebody have their watch display on the whole time, is there?
I don't know if there's any kind of setting. I know it turns off by default, I'm pretty sure, like when you lower it, but I don't know if there's a way to make it turn on the whole time.
Yeah, the Moto 360 lets you keep it on, but I don't think the Apple Watch does. And I don't think it's really necessary.
Yeah. Battery life's probably going to be shaky as it is, so.
What's also maybe interesting to see is the range of the Bluetooth and like that. So like, can you, for example, have like a basketball score app where you can like keep track of the score on your wrist while your watch is like on the bench, or your phone is on the bench?
Yeah, I think for some reason like 100 feet or something like that sticks out. I forget where I heard that number, but something like that, like in the same general vicinity, seems like it'd be possible.
Yeah, 100 feet is pushing it.
That's pushing it.
Yeah, I did a Bluetooth mesh app. And
100
100 feet is hard, phone to phone.
I know they've said something about like if your phone is like downstairs in your house and you're upstairs with your watch, as long as you're on the same Wi-Fi network, that it will continue to work. So, but gyms have terrible Wi-Fi networks.
So if you have, I messed around with this a little bit, and I tried to make like a highly interactive like tap game kind of thing, and I found it pretty much impossible because you can only use buttons. Do you have any other experience with touch interaction?
I mean, not really. In terms of like, were you running into just issues of like the round trip, like it has to tell the extension that something changed, and then you have to like make some decision about how to update the UI? Like, is that?
It was really just the only way I could find to get any touch interaction was to use a button. And the button plays this like half-second animation, and it just like, there's no way to use that for like an interactive game.
Yeah, and especially since you can't control like the tap state of the button.
Yeah, so there's nothing else yet.
Not that I know of.
Okay. Yeah, they're definitely going to do like a Rev 2, I think. Like,
Yeah, you
really
would think so.
some of the controls.
And actually, you bring up a good point with games. I haven't worked on a game for the watch yet, and I haven't actually seen any examples of games for the watch either. I know they're being worked on.
I saw a tic-tac-toe app.
It was like a memory app too, like kind of one of those memory matching.
Okay.
It would have to be something like that.
Yeah.
That's like back and forth.
And I made a flashcard app, which is kind of like, it's like kind of a game. So I made the app that I just released for the fun of it was a flashcard app. So it's kind of a game.
Well, they also tell you that it's only supposed to last like 10 seconds on average, like the use of your app.
Yeah.
So that kind of limits gameplay a little bit.
But I think it makes it, it has to be a certain type of game. Like Words with Friends, except the interaction is 5 seconds instead of 30 or whatever.
Yeah.
You remember those red LED watches? A long time ago.
No.
They were like the first, like real watches that came out that were not, Timex. Anyways, it was a red LED, and that might be the wrong term, but it was red and had like do a couple things on it. And you press a couple of buttons and you can make little stick figures, do, weird shit.
Oh man.
That'd be kind of cool to write something like that, but I don't know if Apple would approve it.
Yeah, I wonder what the review cycle is going to be like. Like, they got a lot of flack for declining or removing so many like today extensions, like peek out, for example. But I wonder what the story is going to be like on the watch. Like, someone's going to build a calculator. Like, is that going to get approved, or is that not considered okay? I mean, I hope that they lean on the side of approving more of those types of things and see like what works and what doesn't.
Well, I think developers in general have to be a lot more sensitive toward the fact that it's a small battery and it's not going to last very long. And Apple's not going to approve things like, you say you're playing a game for 5 hours on your watch. It's not going to last that long. And, I mean, at least until they figure out, better technologies to fit in a bigger watch, better battery technology.
Yeah.
So they last longer. But I think for now, it sounds like it's going to be about 2 hours of use per day. And you're spending, an hour of that playing a game. It's not going to be a whole lot more.
Cool. Thanks, guys.
It was really great. Thanks a lot.
Actually, we have one more question. Do you get any drag events?
No, there's not really like any event type stuff at all. Just like actions for like tapped on a button or tapped on a symbol you sell or tapped on a menu option. That's like the only thing that's like
Tapping, yeah. Okay, cool. But you can use Force Touch, right? Like, it's available.
But the only thing Force Touch does is present the menu options.
Okay, but you can at least customize that.
You can change, you can change the icon and the title of the up to 4 menu options.
Okay.
All right, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Next, I wanted to open it up to any announcements anyone has. Anything going on locally in the community. We had a job opening, anything like that.
Right. I'll be very brief. Hey guys, my name is Martin. I'm CEO of Wonders, and we're a Techstars company located just here at Congress. So we're currently looking to hire our iOS lead developer. Just to give you very quickly, Wonders gathers beautiful visual stories about things like travel, outdoors, and social causes. And we get these stories from places like Patagonia, the brand National Geographic, United Nations, and over 100 photographers and explorers. And it's a very beautiful app, and we're a fun place to work. You'll learn a lot, so I'll be right here if you're interested. Please talk to me. Thank you.
Yes. We have an Android developer meetup in 2 weeks. We got WeWork Tuesday, 2 weeks from now.
That's also kind of interesting.
Okay, awesome. Well, we have this room till 9 o'clock, so feel free to hang out, meet some other people. That was a great presentation. Thanks for coming.